In my opinion, populism is a resurrection of the ideas of the 1930s. They were discredited. I thought they were dead in 1945, and now we find them again, with many of the same philosophical figures motivating the leaders.
Olá, o Canal Brasil tem hoje o privilégio de entrevistar Tom Palmer, norte-americano, autor de vários livros, palestrantes, tem formações na área de filosofia e de ciência política. É hoje uma das mais importantes vozes na defesa das teses liberais. E é com ele que nós vamos conversar hoje. E antes de iniciarmos a conversa, não esqueça de assinar o canal. Tom Palmer, thank you so much for this interview.
It's a pleasure to be here.
I would like to start with the following question. Libertarianism is the same in the 21st century as it was in the 20th century. The pillars are the same, or there is an update to be done?
Well, I think the first point is that word has a kind of unusual provenance because the word liberal in the United States acquired a somewhat different meaning. What would be called liberals in other countries, in America they couldn't call themselves that. So they invented this word, libertarian, which I think is a little bit of an ugly word. It sounds like a genetic experiment between a librarian and a libertine. It really means liberalism. And there's a long tradition around the world with deep roots in many countries. I think the updating, insofar as there is one, is meeting new challenges, coming to understand the historical developments that I think have shifted liberal thinking, but in a way that makes it more true to itself. The most important is the understanding of the rule of law and how central that is to a free society. When I spent time in the Soviet Union, people said, oh, we're going to get rid of communism, it's a catastrophe. And people said, privatize, privatize, privatize. But what we found out was, if there's no legal system, privatize into what? There was no rule of law, no property law, no court system that could adjudicate property disputes, no lawyers to help to write contracts and leases and deeds and all the other things that make a market economy possible. William Niskanen, the late chairman of the Cato Institute, called it the soft infrastructure of the free society. And I think we've come to have a much greater importance of the role of law in the free society. Not that others didn't know that, but now we see how central it is. And in many of the parts of the world, it's not a question of just taking down the government. The government does too much, but it also does too little. It does too little securing the rights of the citizens, providing basic security for the people, and providing a legal system that can adjudicate disputes in a way that's reasonably fair, that everyone can accept. So in that regard, I see liberalism in the 21st century as having a greater focus on the rule of law and building those institutions rather than combating totalitarian communism and fascism and Nazism, which were big challenges in the 20th century.
How about economy and liberalism?
Well, I think one of the things that we have discovered is that the key question we need to face is not what causes poverty, but what causes wealth. And why are some groups excluded from that process? So you find it all around the world. Lane Pritchett from Harvard University, who's been doing development economics for many years, embracing more liberal views all the time, he put it very neatly. He said, mostly in the world, there are not poor people. There are people living in poor places. Take someone from Haiti, the poorest country in the Western Hemisphere. That person gets to the United States or Canada. Within a few years, they're not poor anymore. They can acquire things, their children are going to school, their income rises, all of the good things that come with that. It's not that they were poor people, they lived in a poor place. So we need to ask the questions, what is it that keeps those places poor? Now, that's also not just country by country, where we have aggregate data. We can look at Haiti or Mexico or Bolivia or US, whatever, but within countries as well. And I think that's evident both in the United States and in Brazil, that you have uneven distribution of the institutions that make possible economic prosperity and wealth. So if you look at the favelas in Brazil, one of the problems is the state doesn't provide security for the persons. There's no legal system there, so they're governed by warlords and drug dealers. And life is difficult under those conditions. You lack security of property, and people don't plan for the long term as a consequence. Or something similar in the United States, because we've seen the labor market in the US has become increasingly state-controlled. Go back to 1960, only 5% of occupations required a government license or permission. It's now officially over 23%. You want to be an electrician, a plumber. If you want to shampoo hair in the state of Tennessee, if you want to arrange flowers in the state of Louisiana, you need a permit from the government. So you have to go to flower arranging school. If you want to be an interior decorator in many states, God forbid people would have bad taste in their houses. They have to be protected by the state. These are all guild restrictions. They make it very hard for people to break into the labor market. And then they add another element, which is the really broken criminal justice system in the United States, which incarcerates such a large percentage of the population, nothing to be proud of by any means, but then it stigmatizes them for life. Why? Even after someone gets out of prison, after having allegedly paid some debt back, having a criminal conviction means you can't enter any licensed profession. So they can't become electricians and plumbers and truck drivers and hairdressers and so on. They're kept out of the labor market. So the groups I work with are focusing on these questions of where the state is restricting access and not allowing people to enter the market economy and produce wealth and prosper as a consequence.
You mentioned the importance of the rule of the law in the concept of liberalism. How do you perceive, what's your assessment of the present wave of populism we have around the world, from the left and from the right?
I think that's a very important point to start with. There's left-wing populism and right-wing populism. What they have in common is the same ideology. They hate each other in the way that two criminal gangs hate each other. The Bloods and the Crips in Los Angeles. They have the same philosophy, but they do fight each other for control of territory. But left-wing populism and right-wing populism both share in common a rejection of the ideas of a society governed by law, of rules, of deliberative democratic processes. They want to substitute the idea of will and power as being central to political life. Now, those two groups will come into conflict, but their biggest enemy, the one that they both hate, is liberalism. The idea of a society where people can live together despite having all kinds of differences, religious, philosophical, sexual orientation, ethnic, all those things. A free society has a place for everybody. Everybody who's willing to respect the rights of others can live in that society. They don't like that. They think there's an authentic, true people, and that true people has one will. And that one will is usually expressed in one leader. Well, we heard that philosophy in the 20th century. Ein Volk, ein Reich, ein Führer. One people with one state and with one leader because they had one will. In my opinion, populism is a resurrection of the ideas of the 1930s. They were discredited. I thought they were dead in 1945, and now we find them again, with many of the same philosophical figures motivating the leaders. Carl Schmitt, the German Nazi legal philosophers, Martin Heidegger, and others. When you read the texts, I read a lot of books by right-wing and left-wing populists, you find the same figures, and they are the philosophers of fascism.
And how to face it?
That's a harder question. To diagnose what's happening is one thing, but I think one element that's very important is to reject the politics of hatred. That's what they thrive on, to hate the other person, to hate the other political party. And I think it's very important not to do that, to learn to listen to one another and to say, how can we work this out and live together peacefully? The populists don't want that. They want one party to be triumphant. Ernesto Laclau, one of the big populist theoreticians, an obscure Argentine fascist and Peronist and Marxist, called himself a post-Marxist in his academic career in England. In his book on populist reason, he says that you create a frontier of exclusion within the society between the true people who claim to be the whole population and those who are designated the enemy. And the enemy can vary from country to country. It's the Jews, it's the 1%, it's the casta, as the Podemos party says in Spain. It's immigrants, it's what I call in the US the M&Ms that Trump hates, the Muslims and the Mexicans. There's some enemy out there that we have to defeat. And a liberal response is to reject the enemy mentality. To say we don't want to have enemies. We'd like to learn how to make friends. And that's what the institutions of liberalism are about. Market economy is about exchange that's mutually beneficial. Indeed, even the Greek word kataloktein, it's a wonderful word at the root of the idea of exchange. It means both to exchange and it means to convert an enemy into a friend. And that's what exchange does. And then deliberative processes, debate, discussion, free media. No one is told to shut up. People have the right to express their views. And then we have debates. They're carried out over coffee tables, they're carried out over dinner tables, and they're carried out in legislative chambers in a way that is respectful of the other side. I think that's fundamentally the response, but it will take a different form in every country. Lastly, there is a very good example of the defeat of populism at the ballot box, and that's in Greece. There was a coalition populist government, Syriza, the coalition of the radical left, as it was called, a group of really communist parties that are Stalinists and Maoists and so on. And then the Canal, the independent Greeks, which is a kind of neo-fascist, right-wing, ultra-nationalist grouping. Those two parties were in coalition. Not surprising in this regard that the far left and the far right grouped together. They still had an open, free election, and they were defeated. And a moderate, broadly liberal, what they call in Europe, center-right party, the New Democracy Party, came back. And that's a good example to study. How did they do that? How did they come back with a rational, centrist, democratic, liberal message and defeat these extreme left and right-wing populist parties? It deserves study.
And the roots of this populist wave, where can we find them?
I think there are two ways of looking at the problem. The one I just discussed is the ideological way. Populism is an ideology. It's not always embraced by the people who flock to populist parties, but the leaders of these movements understand it in one way or another. Sometimes they're very bookish. Sometimes, like Donald Trump, they have an intuitive gut understanding of the idea of designating the enemy in order to solidify your base. So that's the ideological question, and I do think that's important and has been understudied. The other one that has received more attention is the sociological dimension, to understand why is this happening? Why do people find these parties attractive? The first point, I think, is we don't find good economic reasons for it. A lot of people have tried to explain this economically. They say middle class is falling, and the data do not support that. I think it's just not supportable. For example, if you look at the United States, people say, oh, wages have been stagnant. This is simply false. Over 20 years, 40 years, 30, 50, whatever time period, real wages have risen, understood in terms of what you can consume. And I remember grew up some of my life in the United States, what it was like when I was a boy, and then what it's like when I'm an adult. It's very different. People are much, much wealthier across all income groups. What, however, seems to be important is relative social standing. And here's an issue that liberals, I think, need to focus on more. Liberals have argued, going back to John Kennedy's famous statement, a rising tide lifts all boats. So if society's becoming richer and we're all becoming richer, who should complain about that? And I think that's fundamentally right, if it's to the benefit of everyone in the society to have more prosperity. But it turns out we're also concerned about the ranking within that. Who is more prestigious than another? We're social primates. We pay attention to that. Well, in a highly dynamic society like the United States, like Brazil, like elsewhere, a lot of people rose in social status. Just look at the US. Women, right? Women running for president and heading big corporations and professors. Their status rose dramatically. African Americans, all the way up to having heads of big companies and the President of the United States of America, the pinnacle of the political leadership, African American, immigrants, racial minorities, sexual minorities, and so on. Well, when you have a relative ranking from 100 down to 1, if someone rises, someone has to fall. They can all be doing better off economically, but in terms of status, one rises means someone fell. Who fell in the United States in social status over the past, let's say, 50 or 60 years? White males who don't have college degrees, who voted overwhelmingly for Donald Trump. And they understood his message, MAGA, Make America Great Again. It told them, America is not great now that it has an African American president. But it was great in the past. What was true then? White men like you ran everything. This is a very strong subconscious appeal to a lot of the population. And they responded to it very, very strongly. We're seeing similar things in Germany and in France, where people who view themselves as having fallen in status have flocked to, in this case, right-wing populist parties. And that means we need to think more carefully about this question of social status and ranking. The last point, a little bit long-winded. I think one answer to that is to open up the market more so those people who've been excluded see more opportunity. And a classic example in the US has been all the licensing laws that restrict wage earners who don't have college degrees. They're becoming more and more and more restrictive. And that means people don't see a future of opportunity for themselves. So that's an area where liberal reforms to free the market and to free the labor market could be a very powerful antidote to this populist resentment.
Another factor shaping the 21st century besides the populism is the rise of China. How a liberal like you describes the Chinese system?
That's a very interesting question. A friend of mine just published a book on China. He's a sinologist and fluent in Chinese, has spent many years there. And what we have seen is that they had a lot of economic reform, but the economic reform was not planned. Deng Xiaoping, when he came into power, he saw people making changes. They weren't willing to live with the commune system. They abandoned it. He recognized what was happening and he got in front of the parade, like a good politician, and championed it. And so they had what they call socialism with Chinese characteristics, which meant private business firms and private ownership and labor market and basically no central planning anymore. But the Communist Party maintained its power. That they didn't give up. And they transformed themselves into an oligarchy of hundreds and hundreds of wealthy families who sent their children to be educated in Australia and the United States and got MBAs and degrees and came back to run the premier state industries of China, which are money-consuming industries. They don't contribute, but they're sources of great wealth and power in China. They're a drain on the overall economy. Xi Jinping, when he came into power, he wanted to destroy the collective leadership China had developed after Mao. And I think it's very dangerous, and a lot of people in China are very worried about this. All power is in one fist now. Not even a committee of people, but one fist. So the last Party Congress made that clear. When he appeared on the stage, there was no one on the stage younger than him. Very clear message. There's no succession that is being planned, which was the way it had been in the past. He's creating a personal dictatorship. I don't think it's going to end well for China. It means that if one dictator makes one bad decision, 1 billion people suffer. And that's not good for the future of China. In the meantime, I do think we should have open trading relations with China. I think it's still better for the Chinese and better for the world. I think Trump's trade policies have been foolish and self-destructive and based on ignorance. Not surprising given his economic team. We're not thoughtful, educated people and have disregarded all of the advice from people who know what they're talking about. However, I do think that one should be very wary of Chinese state companies and of companies involved in deep infrastructure questions. So the Huawei question comes up here. All organizations in China, because of the omnipresence of the Communist Party, are required to have party cells within them. And the party cell is intended to be loyal to the party leadership, not to the company. So someone might be the founder and owner of a company, but there are people who are required to be in the company who take orders that will override his from the party leadership. If Huawei, which may be a well-developed company, they offer lots of value, but if the party says install surveillance software and backdoors into the software, they will do it. And there are reasons based on national security that I think people should be very wary of having a company like Huawei in their telecommunications infrastructure and things of that sort. But when it comes to buying and selling flip-flops and shoes and cars, I think we should have unrestricted free trade with China.
And Latin America on this map of the 21st century. We've seen in recent months upheavals, crisis, political, social in different countries with different political scenarios. What is your assessment of what is happening in Latin America in recent times?
Well, lots of different countries have different circumstances, so I don't see it as just a big continent that's all the same. Brazilians understand that. Brazil by itself is almost like a whole continent or a whole world with so much complexity within it. What we have seen was a general trend away from dictatorship, with the exception of Venezuela. And I thought, as did many, my God, this is a warning to the rest of the continent. Look, don't do that. They're destroying an entire country before our eyes. It was the highest per capita income country in Latin America. Now they're reduced to begging and having just nothing. Nonetheless, that seems not to have scared enough people, in my opinion. So what's been happening in Chile is a very interesting example. I do not believe that all of those destruction of the metro stations planned and coordinated to happen simultaneously just happened spontaneously. Someone was behind that. Nonetheless, there was a possibility to ignite something. It wasn't a cabal that organized all those hundreds of thousands of people to come out in the streets. So that's an interesting question. What's going on in Chile? And I don't believe those who blame it all on some organized subversive group, although there's no doubt that was also playing a role. The systematic, simultaneous destruction of so many metro stations was not spontaneous. But there was a dissatisfaction happening there, and I think that needs to be analyzed further. I can't say I'm an expert on exactly what was going on. I would talk about Brazil's neighbor, though, to the south, which is Argentina. And I think there's a lesson there that Brazilians should pay attention to. And that is that after the corruption and the dysfunction of the Peronist ruling parties for so long, there was a turn, and when the mayor of Buenos Aires was elected and brought into a position with authority and a mandate, instead of bringing about the reforms that could have been done, he talked about gradualismo. Slowly, 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 slowly. And nothing happened. Nothing happened. And the expectations of the population were dashed. And now we have the same failed philosophy back in power again. And I think there's a lesson there. That if you're going to really liberalize the economy, if you're really going to create economic opportunity, don't give us a 50-year plan. You need to tell us as voters in whatever country we are in, these things are going to be done. There will be short-term pain, but there will be great benefits over the longer term. And then do it.
The Brazilian government is learning this lesson from Argentina?
We will see. I did meet in Brasilia with very interesting people at the ENAP, the National School of Public Administration, and elsewhere. And I think people are focused on this question. They need to bring about reforms that can show people things can be better and not just a lot of talk. I hope that they get it right. But it also means that there are the people in the population who are supporting them. Say, let's get it done. We have a mandate against corruption. Brazilian people made that very clear. They were just sick of it. They had it right up to here. Well, we want to see something done about that so that you can experience in your life that's going to actually go down. You won't be shaken down, and you won't see money siphoned off of the public budgets anymore. I think that good steps were taken with the economic liberty law. Seems to have been very solid, and it means changes in the administrative procedures that should show benefits for entrepreneurs, for workers, and that also means then for consumers as well. But it needs to be pushed through and not put off.
Venezuela aside, is democracy solid enough in Latin America?
I think so. I think that the era of caudillos and generals running countries is probably just behind us. Venezuela is an outlier. I don't think it's a harbinger for the rest of the continent. And the reason is that the vast bulk of the population hates the Maduro government. They see what has happened. They know that. Why are they not rising up against it? It's because they outsourced security and terror to the Cuban government. In effect, Venezuela, this very large, formerly wealthy country, is a colony of a tiny, impoverished country in the Caribbean, Cuba. How did that happen? Well, Chavez made a deal with the Castro family, and communism is always a family enterprise in the end. It's like the mafia state, and it's the Castro family and all of their friends and cousins and cronies who benefit from it. If you saw the pictures of Castro's grandson on his yacht, he put it on Instagram. It caused a little bit of a sensation as a consequence. That's how the rulers live. But they made a deal, which was, we'll provide oil, money, you provide us security. And so throughout the Venezuelan armed forces, the police, the interior forces, the official armed forces, you have Venezuelan command structure and a parallel Cuban command structure. And the Cubans are there to keep the Venezuelans loyal. This is how they organized in the Soviet Union and in the Third Reich in Nazi Germany. You had military officers and then political officers from the party. That's what the SS was for the German military. Kept them loyal to the leadership of the party. In the Venezuelan case, that's the role of the Cubans. So even if Venezuelans said, we won't do it, we won't fire on the crowds anymore, there's a Cuban to enforce it. How do you keep the Cubans loyal? Their families are back in Cuba. That's a very difficult system for anyone to break. But it's not replicated in any other Latin American country. So I think Venezuela, for that reason, is an outlier.
Going back to Argentina, you think that the present administration could have learned the lessons from Macri and be a more moderate government?
I don't have a crystal ball, and we have seen some cases where governments of the left have initiated free market reforms. New Zealand is a very good example of that, going back to the 1980s. So it's not impossible. I wish that would happen. I don't really care whether a government calls itself left or right or up or down. If they initiate good policies, maintain the rule of law, and create the right incentives in a free economy to generate prosperity, that makes me happy. And I think that's enough. So I don't care if they call themselves left, right, or anything else. I worry that that's not the case, that it's the same faces that we saw before, with the same ideology. And given the high level of personal corruption that the previous government showed, the famous Minister of Justice with the bags of cash when he was arrested, taking them out of a religious establishment and found with just bags of money by the police, that suggests that personal gain is of great importance to them. I hope that they will have learned that lesson, and I hope that they'll become more patriotic and more concerned about the future of their country. At this point, I think it's just a hope.
And in Latin America, we could see a few years ago very clear movements of the political pendulum, going to the right and then going to the left. What is happening to this pendulum now?
It's a very interesting and deep question because I don't see it as being just continent-wide. I think that there are movements afoot throughout Latin America of dissatisfaction. I think that it would be beneficial for the countries if people ask questions about what is more likely to make life better. That's really the key thing. I'm convinced that institutions of market economy and rule of law are better for everyone in the society. But they're better in a little bit of the long run. It could be instituting them today would be a little painful for me if I lose my subsidy, if I lose my petrol subsidy or something like that. But for the long run, everyone is better off as a consequence. It means that people should look a little bit more to the long run consequences. But it also means that you need a political leadership who can explain that to the population clearly, who can be honest, who can say, look, this is what needs to happen. And these changes have been shown to work in other countries, and they can work here. I've seen Paulo Guedes speak a number of times, in both English and Portuguese with translation, and I think he speaks directly to people. And the success of the pension reform, I think, was evidence of that, because it was about being fair and having something that will last. Not that I want to get another 100 reais this month for me personally, but being concerned about having something left for my children and grandchildren. And that, I think, was an important part of the public debate on the pension law, and it was a very healthy conversation to happen. So I think that that was a good sign for the future of Brazil. That needs to happen elsewhere, including in the United States. So far, on pension reform, there's been no adult conversation held. But it's really it's about numbers. It's about time and numbers. Canada had an adult grown-up conversation about this, and they were able to reform the state pension system so it would persist over the longer time. This hasn't happened yet in the United States because the parties are so opposed to each other. It happened in Brazil, and I think that that was really remarkable.
Last question, Tom. We journalists, we love crystal balls. This wave of populism around the world, long-term, short-term, how about its future? How long is it going to last?
I wish I had a crystal ball. For one thing, I'd be rich because I'd know the stock prices tomorrow. I don't. I think it's going to be with us for some time. And it means that people who favor liberal democracy and an open society, or I should say open societies, and pluralism, the coexistence of different views and different ways of life in one society, need to think seriously how to defend against it. So I spent a lot of time in Central Europe. Populist parties are in power in Poland, in power in Hungary, and now the opposition party in Germany is a very populist, anti-liberal, anti-democratic, frankly, party. I don't think they're just going to wither and go away tomorrow. One reason is, once they get in power, they change the rules of the game so they can't ever be defeated. That's what Viktor Orban did in Hungary. It's what's happening right now with the Kaczynski government in Poland. Once they are in power, they say, we are the only authentic people. Other people are the enemy. Why should we let the enemy win an election? And they rewrite all the rules, so although it's still formally democratic, they have votes, you can't defeat them because they've rigged the game after that. And we have to work very hard to make sure they're not able to basically destroy democracy in the name of the people. Democracy means the people is complex. There's many different views and so on. For them, it's not. The people is one monolith. It has one will, one party, and one leader. I think it's a formidable challenge to the free society. And I don't see it going away in 5 or 10 years. I think it's going to be a 20, 25-year struggle. And in my lifetime, that means something closer like the struggle against communism, which is something I worked very hard on, undermining communism while it still existed in Soviet Union and in Eastern Europe. And I'm prepared for a similar defense of liberal democracy against populism like the fight we undertook against communism.
Tom Palmer, thank you so much for the interview. It was a privilege.
Thank you. It's a pleasure for me.